Tonight, we follow the trail of an order that stood in the shadows of history. Not the Templars you know, but their rivals. The Knights Hospitaller, healers by name, warriors by necessity, and guardians of secrets that still whisper through the stones of Rhodes and Malta. For centuries, they were seen as men of mercy, tending to the sick and sheltering pilgrims. But behind the white cross lay something darker. Manuscripts written in cipher, relics hidden in vaults, and bloodlines preserved in silence. They did not just defend fortresses, they defended memory itself. The Hospitallers built networks of spies and bankers, carved symbols into chapels that spoke of secrets too dangerous for pulpits, and outlived kings, popes, and even their Templar rivals. When walls fell, they carried their archives. When empires shifted, they stayed, always watching, always guarding. This isn't simply about knights and crusades. It is about hidden legacies that shaped Europe, rivalries that blurred into conspiracies, and symbols etched in plain sight that we still walk past today. So, before you think this is just a story of swords and shields, ask yourself, what if the greatest treasures of the Crusades were never lost at all? What if they are still here, locked away in the silence of the Hospitallers? Like the video, subscribe, because tonight we step into the Order of the Black Cross, and some secrets were never meant to be revealed. The air in Jerusalem was thick with dust and prayer, a city where merchants bargained, priests chanted, and pilgrims limped in from every corner of Christendom. Imagine it. The year is 1095. The First Crusade has been called, and waves of men and women are pouring into the Holy Land with blistered feet, hungry stomachs, and souls aching for salvation. Among the chaos stood a single refuge, a hospital not in the modern sense but a sanctuary, a place of care in a city torn apart by faith and blood. This is where the Knights Hospitaller were born, not as warriors, not yet, but as healers. The Order of St. John began humbly, a brotherhood devoted to serving the sick and poor. They wore simple robes, their symbol a white cross, their purpose clear. They offered bread to the starving, beds to the dying, and water to the parched. Yet, even in these acts of mercy, there was danger. Jerusalem was no safe haven. Bandits roamed the roads, rival armies clashed, and pilgrims carrying nothing but faith often fell victim before ever reaching the gates. The Hospitallers saw that healing bodies was not enough. Protection was needed. Slowly, their mission shifted. Swords were taken up alongside bandages. Armor was strapped over robes. These men of mercy became men of war, a paradox at the heart of their story. A knight who was sworn to heal could also kill. A monk who prayed at dawn might ride into battle by dusk. This was no ordinary order. It was something new, a brotherhood bound by oaths both sacred and bloody. The streets of Jerusalem echoed with the cries of the wounded, yet behind the stone walls of the hospital, a different sound emerged, the whispers of a growing power. Donations from kings and nobles flowed in. Land was granted. Commanderies sprouted across Europe, each sending money, supplies, and recruits back to the Holy Land. The Hospitallers were becoming more than servants. They were building an empire of faith and steel. But their rise was not without shadow. Rumours spread that within their hospitals were not only patients but secrets. Scrolls smuggled from fallen churches, relics guarded with unnatural devotion, maps said to mark places buried deep beneath Jerusalem's soil. Some whispered that what they healed was not only flesh but memory itself, keeping alive fragments of knowledge the church might prefer forgotten. To most pilgrims, they were saints in armour. To others, they were keepers of something far older. Their rivals noticed. The Templars, forged in the same fires of the Crusades, began to see the Hospitallers not just as brothers in arms, but as competitors. Who would guard the pilgrims? Who would hold the relics? Who would stand closer to God? The rivalry would grow in the centuries to come, but in these first years it was Jerusalem itself that defined the Hospitallers. A city of wounds and wonders. where a hospital became the seed of an order that would shape history. And so it began, not in a battlefield, not in a throne room, but in a crowded stone hospice where the sick whispered prayers and knights carried both sword and salve. A place where mercy and violence fused, and a question was born that has never truly been answered. Can an order serve both the cross and the sword, or does one always consume the other? The Knights Hospitaller would spend centuries trying to prove it could be both. The year is 1105. The dust of the First Crusade still clings to the stones of Jerusalem. The pilgrims who stagger into the holy city carry scars not just of travel, but of battle. And the men of the hospital see it all. At first their work is simple: food, water, beds, the comfort of prayer whispered into the ears of the dying. But the streets outside their walls are restless. Armies march past, Saracen raiders attack the roads, and the sick who recover are too often cut down before they can even return home. The brothers of the hospital begin to ask themselves a question: is it enough to heal if you cannot protect? The answer changes everything. The Hospitallers slowly take on a new role. They do not abandon the wounded, but they add another duty. They will become guardians as well as healers. Armour is fitted over robes. The white cross that once marked only compassion now gleams on shields. The order becomes a strange hybrid: monks with swords, nurses with spears. To the outside world, it feels like a contradiction. To the Hospitallers, it feels inevitable. The roads to Jerusalem must be safe, and only steel can guarantee it. As they grow, so does their need for structure. They cannot remain a loose band of brothers tending beds and carrying swords. They develop rules, strict codes of conduct. A Grand Master leads them, chosen from among the most loyal and capable knights. Beneath him are commanders who oversee regions, priors who run commanderies, and sergeants who serve with discipline. Every member has a place. Every action is bound by vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. It is a military machine disguised in the robes of mercy. The pilgrims who see them on the roads are stunned. One moment a Hospitaller is bandaging a wound, the next he is charging into a skirmish with enemies of the cross. Their reputation spreads quickly. Kings hear of their valour, nobles hear of their discipline, and soon donations pour in. Castles, lands, and fortresses are granted to them across Europe. With each gift, their influence deepens. The Hospitallers are no longer simply a hospital order in Jerusalem. They are becoming an international force. Yet within their walls, something else takes root. Their codes are not just practical, they are symbolic. Every rank, every vow, every ritual hints at layers of meaning. The Grand Master is not only a leader, but a guardian of knowledge. Their ceremonies echo with prayers that feel older than the Crusades themselves. Some whisper that their rules conceal secrets, fragments of wisdom carried from the East, preserved under the guise of discipline. The line between soldier, monk, and custodian of hidden truths blurs until they are all one. By the time the 12th century dawns, the Hospitallers are no longer simply healers. They have become warriors in full. Their hospitals stand as fortresses. Their robes conceal chainmail. Their prayers are followed by battle cries. And in the hearts of both allies and enemies, they inspire the same mix of awe and fear. To fight them is to face men who see death not as defeat, but as service. To follow them is to belong to an order where healing and killing, faith and war, charity and power are all bound together by the same white cross. The transformation is complete, and with it, the world has gained not just a hospital, but a brotherhood of warriors sworn to defend their cause at any cost. The streets of Jerusalem in the early 12th century were alive with tension. The Crusader kingdom was still young, fragile, and always under threat. In the midst of this fragile order, two brotherhoods began to rise, both sworn to defend pilgrims and both claiming the mantle of holy service. On one side were the Knights Hospitaller, men in black robes marked with a white cross, healers turned warriors. On the other were the newly founded Knights Templar, clad in white with a red cross blazing across their tunics. At first, they seemed like allies, united under the same banner of faith. But it did not take long before rivalry began to burn beneath the surface. The Templars had been granted the Temple Mount itself, a prize of immeasurable weight. Their name, their prestige, and their authority came from the heart of Jerusalem. They quickly became favoured by kings and popes who admired their discipline and feared their power. The Hospitallers, once the foremost protectors of pilgrims, suddenly found themselves challenged. Who would control the roads? Who would guard the holy relics? Who would claim the loyalty of Christendom? Competition was not only spiritual, it was financial. Both orders relied on donations, lands, and privileges granted by nobles eager to earn divine favour. When a count or duke had to choose between giving wealth to the hospital or to the temple, the choice became a matter of politics. The more the Templars gained, the more the Hospitallers had to fight to maintain their influence. Jealousies grew. Pilgrims whispered that the Templars were more arrogant, while others claimed the Hospitallers were too worldly. Rival propaganda spread as fast as rumours of miracles. Sacred sites became battlegrounds of prestige. Commanderies and churches were built side by side, each order striving to outshine the other in piety and strength. In Jerusalem itself, their processions sometimes crossed in the narrow streets, the black robes of the Hospitallers brushing against the white of the Templars. To the ordinary pilgrim, it looked like unity, but to those who listened closely, the silence between the two groups was heavy, cold, and sharp. Yet their rivalry was more than politics. It was a clash of identities. The Hospitallers had begun as healers and saw themselves as protectors of both body and soul. Their hospitals remained open to the poor and the sick, even as their knights fought battles. The Templars, by contrast, were born as warriors from the start. They carried the aura of the Temple Mount, and their discipline made them legends on the battlefield. To one order, faith meant charity. To the other, faith meant sacrifice in combat. By the year 1139, the papacy had officially blessed both orders, confirming their rights and privileges. But instead of peace, the recognition deepened the rivalry. Each order now stood as a pillar of Christendom, yet the space between those pillars was filled with suspicion. Some whispered of secret knowledge guarded by the Templars, others of hidden relics kept in Hospitaller vaults. Each order accused the other of hoarding power that belonged to God alone. In the end, the rivalry was not open war. They still fought side by side against Muslim armies. They still shared the same cause. But behind the banners, behind the prayers, a struggle for dominance smouldered. The Hospitallers and the Templars had begun as brothers in arms, but by the 12th century they were rivals in destiny. Their competition would shape not only the fate of Jerusalem, but the future of all Europe. And though both wore the cross, only one could hope to carry the greater share of power. Jerusalem was more than a city of stone and shrines. Beneath its streets lay tunnels, chambers, and ruins that whispered of older worlds. To the outside eye, the Hospitallers were healers and warriors, but legends began to form that behind the walls of their hospitals they were something else entirely, custodians of secrets that stretched far beyond the care of pilgrims. Some claimed that when the Hospitallers tended to the sick, they also collected stories, listening carefully to travellers who carried fragments of forgotten lore. Others believed they uncovered relics and manuscripts hidden since the days of the Apostles, treasures buried when the Romans destroyed the temple centuries earlier. The hospital itself was said to contain vaults carved deep into the rock, chambers where relics glowed faintly in torchlight, and scrolls bound in crumbling leather rested on wooden shelves. Pilgrims never saw these places. They saw beds and bread and prayer, but whispers suggested the Hospitallers preserved more than bodies. They preserved knowledge, maps marked with routes that led not only across the land but into ruins long forbidden. texts written in languages the average knight could not read, Greek, Hebrew, Arabic, stored with equal care as relics of saints. This reputation as secret keepers only grew as their rivalry with the Templars deepened. The Templars were famous for their association with the Temple Mount, their mysterious years of excavation beneath the holy site. Yet some chronicles hint that the Hospitallers too had access to hidden archives. They were not soldiers blundering in search of treasure. They were healers trained to observe details, to catalogue, to remember. Perhaps that same discipline carried into their preservation of knowledge. Some suggested that the order became a living library, fragments of medicine blended with fragments of theology, astronomy mixed with scripture, all guarded behind stone walls. The relics were more than holy bones and splinters of the true cross. Pilgrims spoke of strange items never displayed publicly, a chalice said to hum when touched, a shroud that carried marks no one could explain. Even metal objects inscribed with symbols not of Latin or Greek, but of older, stranger alphabets. Were they real artifacts or inventions of rumour? In truth, the line between myth and reality was often blurred in Jerusalem, but the persistence of these stories hints at something unusual. The Hospitallers themselves never spoke of these things in public. Their rules demanded silence, their ceremonies were closed. But travellers from the east, who visited their commanderies, reported signs carved into doorways, stars, crosses, and roses that seemed to carry meanings beyond decoration. Some said these were coded markers, signals to those who knew how to read them, a language of symbols hidden in plain sight. By the middle of the 12th century, the Hospitallers were not only warriors and not only healers. They had become, in the eyes of many pilgrims, guardians of mysteries. To some, this was a blessing, proof that divine wisdom was still being preserved. To others, it was a threat, a reminder that power does not always lie in swords or crowns, but in knowledge locked away. The question remains, what did the Hospitallers truly guard in those stone vaults? Were they protectors of relics or custodians of truths that could never safely be spoken? The silence of the order leaves only shadows and speculation, and perhaps that is exactly how they wanted it. By the middle of the 12th century, the Knights Hospitaller had become more than a brotherhood of healers or even a band of warrior monks. They had grown into something far larger, a power that stretched across continents, a force that rivaled kings. Their strength was not only in their vows or their swords, but in the structures they built. Commanderies, castles, and fleets formed the backbone of an order that began to look less like a hospital and more like a state of its own. Everywhere across Europe, from France to Spain to the German lands, noble families donated land to the Hospitallers. These estates became commanderies, self-sufficient centres where brothers farmed, trained, and prayed. They were not monasteries in the quiet sense, but military hubs feeding resources back to the east. Grain harvested in Burgundy might end up feeding soldiers in Acre. Gold donated by an English baron might be turned into walls rising above the coast of the Levant. Each commandery was a pillar, and together they formed a network that no single king controlled. In the Holy Land itself, the Hospitallers turned their skill for organisation into fortifications. Castles such as Crac des Chevaliers rose like mountains of stone, bristling with towers and walls, so thick that even the mightiest armies struggled to breach them. These fortresses were not just military bases, they were symbols. To stand before them was to see faith made solid, stone shaped into defiance. They became safe havens for pilgrims, hospitals for the wounded, and at the same time staging grounds for knights preparing to ride into battle. The blend of mercy and war was written into the very architecture, but perhaps the most unexpected arm of the Hospitallers was their navy. Long before other orders built fleets, the black sails of the hospital carried across the Mediterranean. Their ships escorted pilgrims, carried supplies, and when needed, unleashed war at sea. They became masters of the routes between Europe and the East, their fleets as feared by pirates as they were respected by merchants. In time, their naval power would only grow, setting the stage for their dominance centuries later on islands like Rhodes and Malta. All of this made the Hospitallers something unusual. They owed allegiance to the Pope, yes, but in practice they operated with near independence. Kings could not command them, local lords could not tax them. Their network of commanderies, castles, and fleets answered only to their Grand Master. This gave them a reach unlike any other institution of the age. They could gather wealth in England, store it in France, and spend it in Jerusalem without bowing to a single crown along the way. In a world where kings rose and fell, the Hospitallers endured. Such power did not go unnoticed. Some saw them as holy warriors, the shield of Christendom. Others saw them as a state within a state, dangerous in their independence, untouchable in their privilege. But whether feared or admired, the fact remained. The Hospitallers were no longer a band of brothers tending a hospital in Jerusalem. They were pillars of faith and steel, their cross shining not just on robes but on fortress walls and sails. A new kind of power had been born, one that would outlast kingdoms and carve its own path through history. The city of Acre was the beating heart of the Crusader states. Its harbours swarmed with ships from Italy, France, and the distant shores of England. Its markets were alive with spices, silks, and voices speaking in every tongue of the Mediterranean. But Acre was also a fortress, the last great holdout of Christian power in the Holy Land, and the Knights Hospitaller stood at its very core. For them, Acre was not just a city, it was a test of their soul. By the late 13th century, the crusading dream was crumbling. Jerusalem had been lost, castles had fallen one by one, and the Muslim forces led by the Mamluks were tightening their grip. Acre became the final refuge, the last bastion of Christendom in the east. The Hospitallers were tasked with defending it, their black robes marked with the white cross standing out against the battlements. They were not alone. The Templars held their own quarter, the Venetians guarded their docks, but the Hospitallers carried the heavy burden of both mercy and war. Inside the city, their hospitals overflowed. Pilgrims who had dreamed of touching the holy places now arrived battered and bleeding, and the brothers tended to them with the same care as in the days of Jerusalem. Yet at the same time, those same brothers sharpened swords and donned armour, preparing for the storm they knew was coming. It was here that the tension between their spiritual vows and their military duty reached its sharpest point. Could a man who healed in the morning fight to kill by afternoon? The Hospitallers lived this contradiction every day in Acre. The siege came in the year 1291. The Mamluks unleashed their full might against the walls. Siege towers rolled forward, catapults hurled stones the size of oxen, and waves of soldiers crashed against the gates. The Hospitallers fought with grim determination. Chroniclers describe them standing shoulder to shoulder, their cross gleaming in the smoke, refusing to yield even as walls crumbled around them. But when they returned to their quarters between battles, they found the wounded waiting, and once again they became healers, binding wounds, whispering prayers, and offering bread to men who might not live another day. The fall of Acre was inevitable. No fortress, no matter how strong, could hold forever against such relentless assault. By May, the walls were breached. Chaos erupted in the streets. Some fled to the ships in the harbour. Others fought to the death in narrow alleys. The Hospitallers, true to their vows, stayed to the last. Their Grand Master William of Villaret fought with them, sword in hand, until they were forced to retreat onto the sea. Acre burned behind them, and with it the dream of a Crusader kingdom. For the Hospitallers, the loss of Acre was more than a military defeat. It was a wound to their very identity. Their mission had always been to serve pilgrims in the Holy Land, but with the Holy Land lost, what were they now? Warriors without a battlefield, healers without a sacred city. The fall of Acre forced them to become something new. It would push them to the seas, to new islands, to new fortresses, and to new roles that would carry their power far beyond Jerusalem. But the memory of Acre never faded. It was both their greatest stand and their greatest loss, a symbol of the impossible balance they tried to keep between the sword and the cross. They stood on the same battlefields, fought the same enemies, and prayed to the same God. Yet between the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller, there was always a shadow. To the pilgrims who saw them march in solemn processions through the streets of Acre, or stand side by side upon the walls, they looked like brothers in arms. But behind the white tunics marked with a red cross and the black robes marked with a white one, there pulsed a rivalry as sharp as any blade. Allies, yes, but only when necessity forced them. In truth, they were adversaries, competing for power, influence, and perhaps even for secrets too dangerous to name. The roots of this rivalry reached back to Jerusalem. The Templars had been granted the Temple Mount, a gift that gave them prestige and a base shrouded in mystery. For 9 years they dug beneath the ancient stones, and rumours whispered that they had uncovered relics, scrolls, or even treasures left from Solomon's temple. The Hospitallers did not enjoy the same aura of mystery. Their authority came from their hospitals, from the care of the sick and wounded. To many pilgrims, the Hospitallers felt more approachable, but to kings and popes, the Templars carried the glamour of holy warriors bound to the temple itself. From the start, both orders found themselves competing for the trust of Christendom. The rivalry was not merely about prestige, it was about resources. Both orders depended on lands and donations from Europe. A nobleman might gift his estate to the Hospitallers, only to be pressured later by Templars who promised him greater spiritual rewards. Castles, ports, and even whole villages became prizes in a game where both orders played. Their independence from kings gave them unique power, and their wealth grew to the point that monarchs borrowed money from them. For some, the Hospitallers and Templars looked less like monks and more like rival kingdoms that wore the cross as their crown. But there was another layer to the rivalry, one that was never spoken aloud. Both orders were said to keep secrets. The Templars were accused of guarding relics too holy or too heretical to reveal. A grail, a shroud, a gospel. The Hospitallers were rumoured to hold maps of hidden routes and manuscripts smuggled from the east. Pilgrims told tales of vaults beneath their hospitals, where strange symbols marked the walls. The Templars' mysteries made them feared. The Hospitallers' silence made them trusted. Together, they created an air of suspicion that lingered over every crusade. When the two orders stood against Muslim armies, their rivalry was put aside. On the battlefield, they fought like lions, often covering each other in retreat, their banners snapping side by side. Yet, even in victory, there was tension. Who would claim the glory? Whose relics would be paraded through the streets? Whose coffers would be filled with spoils and donations? These questions gnawed at the fragile unity between them. By the late 13th century, as the crusading dream began to die, whispers grew darker. Some claimed the Hospitallers plotted to absorb the Templars. Others claimed the Templars sought to destroy their rivals. And when the Templars fell under the crushing hand of King Philip of France in 1407, the Hospitallers inherited much of their property. Was it fate or was it design? The question still lingers. Allies or adversaries, brothers or rivals, the Templars and Hospitallers shaped each other's destiny as much as their own. They were mirrors locked in eternal competition, reflecting not just faith, but the hidden hunger for power that burned beneath the cross. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre was the most sacred site in all of Jerusalem. Pilgrims came from every corner of Christendom to touch its stones, to kneel where they believed Christ had been crucified, buried, and risen. To them, it was not just a church, but the very heart of faith. Yet, in the shadows of its chapels and tombs, a different story was whispered. The Hospitallers, whose hospital lay nearby, were said to have collected relics from within its walls, relics too powerful to be displayed openly. Some claimed they were protectors of the treasure of the Holy Sepulchre, a collection of sacred objects hidden away while pilgrims gazed at the altars above. The stories began in the early 12th century, when Jerusalem was still in Christian hands. pilgrims noticed Hospitaller brothers moving at night through the church, carrying bundles wrapped in cloth. To the faithful, these were merely supplies or offerings, but the rumours soon grew. Were they relics, fragments of the true cross, vials of holy oil, manuscripts forgotten by time? Chroniclers from Europe later repeated these tales, adding that maps and coded texts had been stored in Hospitaller vaults, documents said to trace the holy sites of the city as well as paths beneath it. These maps, some believed, rivaled the mysterious hoards attributed to the Templars. The Hospitallers themselves never admitted anything. Their vow of silence on such matters only deepened the mystery. But the legends persisted. One story told of a reliquary made of gold and crystal, said to contain a single drop of blood from the crucifixion. Another described a chalice carved from green stone, its rim etched with symbols that looked neither Latin nor Greek. Still, another spoke of a map drawn on lambskin, showing hidden chambers beneath the Mount of Olives and routes stretching toward the desert monasteries of Egypt. None of these objects were ever shown publicly, yet pilgrims swore they had heard whispers from brothers who had seen them with their own eyes. What made these tales so compelling was their secrecy. Unlike the Templars, who often carried an aura of mystery around the Temple Mount, the Hospitallers were known for their hospitals and their open acts of charity. If they held relics in secret, it meant they were guardians, not for glory or fame, but for protection. Some argued that the relics were too dangerous to display. A fragment of the cross could ignite wars. A gospel not approved by the church could split faith in two. A map leading to ancient tombs could tempt kings and thieves alike. Better, perhaps, that such things remain in silence beneath stone. When Jerusalem fell and the Crusader kingdom crumbled, many wondered what became of these treasures. Did the Hospitallers smuggle them out under the cover of chaos? Were they hidden in castles like Crac des Chevaliers, or carried to the islands of Rhodes and Malta? Or did they vanish entirely, melted into legend? The truth remains buried. What survives are the stories, the haunting possibility that somewhere, hidden in a vault or beneath a forgotten chapel, the treasure of the Holy Sepulchre still waits. Not gold, not jewels, but relics that could rewrite faith itself, and the order sworn to heal and protect may have been its secret keepers all along. The year was 1187. The heat of a summer sun bore down on the hills of the Holy Land as armies gathered for one of the most decisive battles in history. At Hattin, the Crusader host was shattered, and in the days that followed, Jerusalem itself fell into the hands of Saladin. For nearly a century, the city had stood under Christian rule, guarded by Templars, Hospitallers, and countless pilgrims who believed its stones were the centre of the world. Now the dream was broken. The cross was torn down from the dome of the rock. The bells of the church of the Holy Sepulchre were silenced, and the orders that had grown in its shadow faced a question that would define their future. For the Hospitallers, the fall of Jerusalem was more than the loss of a home. It was the loss of their origin, their hospital, their wards, their patients, all swept away in the tide of conquest. Yet, even in defeat, they did not scatter. Chroniclers write of Hospitaller brothers carrying the wounded through the chaos, of knights forming rearguards that allowed civilians to flee, of priests smuggling relics out under cover of darkness. The white cross on black cloth became a symbol not only of mercy, but of defiance, a reminder that though the city had fallen, the order would not. Among the whispers that followed the conquest were darker stories. Some claimed that the Hospitallers had hidden manuscripts in sealed vaults, maps of underground passages and relics too sacred to lose. Legends say that as Saladin's banners rose over Jerusalem, secret tunnels beneath churches and hospitals were emptied in haste. Chests were carried westward, their contents known only to the Grand Master and a few chosen brothers. Were these simply records of land and wealth, or were they pieces of the holy knowledge the Order had guarded in silence for decades? The truth remains elusive, but the timing of their disappearance has kept the mystery alive. Forced from the holy city, The Hospitallers retreated first to the coastal strongholds and then to the island of Cyprus. There, far from the sacred streets of Jerusalem, they began to rebuild. Their hospitals were re-established, their fleets expanded, and their castles rose again in stone. Yet something had changed. No longer tied to the daily care of pilgrims walking the Via Dolorosa, the order became more military, more hardened. They still healed, they still prayed, but now their gaze shifted outward to the sea, to Rhodes, to Malta, and beyond. Jerusalem was gone, but their mission would adapt. For the pilgrims left behind, the fall of Jerusalem was the end of an age. For the Hospitallers, it was the beginning of a transformation. They had lost their sacred city, but in losing it they carried something intangible with them, the memory of what had been, and perhaps the secrets of what had been hidden. The road to Cyprus was not just a retreat. It was a passage into a new era where the white cross on black would no longer mark a hospital in Jerusalem, but an order that stood untethered from place, moving wherever history demanded. And somewhere in that shift, perhaps in the silence of their vaults, the hidden knowledge they had preserved survived, waiting for the moment it would matter again. The loss of Jerusalem forced the Hospitallers to change their nature. No longer bound to the holy city, they looked to the sea. The Mediterranean became their new battlefield and their new lifeline. From their base in Cyprus and later in Rhodes, the order began to build not just castles but ships, and soon their white cross flew over black sails that struck fear into pirates and pride into pilgrims. The brothers who once healed in hospitals now trained as sailors and captains, forging a fleet that would dominate the waves. The Mediterranean in the 13th century was a sea of trade and war. Merchants carried silks from the east, spices from Arabia, and gold from Africa. Pirates hunted these routes, and rival powers sought to control them. Into this chaos, the Hospitallers launched their galleys. Long, sleek, and fast, their ships cut across the waves with discipline that mirrored their life on land. Each vessel was both a weapon and a sanctuary. Pilgrims who feared the dangers of travel often booked passage under Hospitaller escort, knowing that the sight of the cross on the sails kept raiders at bay. But the fleet was more than a guard service. It was power. Whoever controlled the sea controlled the flow of goods, money, and people. The Hospitallers began to use their naval reach not just for defense, but for influence. They could blockade a rival port, escort a favored ally, or intercept enemies of the church. Their ships became moving fortresses, extensions of their commanderies on land, and through them the order carved out an empire across the waves. In time, their navy rivaled the great maritime republics of Venice and Genoa. For a brotherhood that had once been a hospital in Jerusalem, the transformation was astonishing. With this power came whispers. Some claimed the Hospitallers used their fleets to transport more than pilgrims and grain. Hidden in their cargo were said to be relics, maps, and documents too precious to risk by land. The sea was their vault, the shifting waves a perfect cover for secrets that could not be allowed to fall into the hands of rivals. Their control of shipping lanes meant they could move knowledge across continents without interference. A chest loaded onto a Hospitaller galley in Cyprus might appear in Provence months later, unseen by kings or popes. This secrecy made them formidable and, to some, suspicious. The fleet also gave them independence. Unlike the Templars, whose power was tied to land and finance, the Hospitallers had mobility. They could retreat when needed, strike where least expected, and appear on distant shores with little warning. Their naval supremacy made them more than a religious order. They were becoming a sovereign force, answerable only to their Grand Master and to God. By the time they established themselves in Rhodes, their fleet had grown into one of the most feared in the Mediterranean. Muslim corsairs avoided their patrols. Christian kings courted their favour. Merchants prayed to see their sails on the horizon. The Hospitallers had found a new identity, one forged in salt and steel. The sea became their kingdom, and with it came a reach that extended far beyond what any Crusader castle could achieve. They were no longer just knights of the hospital. They were lords of the waves, wielding the sea itself as both sword and shield, and behind their sails, the silence of hidden cargo suggested that their most precious treasures were never left behind on land. When the Hospitallers arrived at the island of Rhodes in the year 1309, they found more than a refuge. They found a stage on which to reinvent themselves. The island lay like a jewel in the eastern Mediterranean, close to trade routes, close to the Ottoman frontier, and perfectly suited to become both fortress and kingdom. For the first time, the order did not simply guard a hospital or hold a castle within another man's realm. Here they ruled outright. Rhodes was theirs, and they would transform it into a citadel that announced their power to the world. The brothers wasted no time. Massive walls began to rise around the city. Towers soared, bastions jutted out like clenched fists, and deep moats carved the ground into layers of defense. To any outsider, it looked like military genius, but to those who looked closely, there was something more. The fortifications of Rhodes seemed to follow patterns that echoed older mysteries. Geometric alignments, ratios tied to sacred numbers, and carvings hidden in the stone suggested that the Hospitallers were not only building walls of defense, but walls of meaning. Some scholars later pointed to the way the bastions formed 7 points around the city, a shape long linked to divine perfection. Others noticed spiral designs etched into gates, symbols resembling stars and crosses interlaced. To the ordinary soldier, these were decoration. To the Hospitallers, they may have been reminders that their struggle was not only against armies, but against forces of a more hidden kind. Rhodes became both shield and symbol, a fortress where stone and spirit blended into one. The island itself offered new opportunities. From Rhodes, the Hospitaller fleet patrolled the seas, intercepting pirates, harassing Ottoman ships, and escorting pilgrims. Their black sails, marked with the white cross, became a familiar sight in the Aegean. Yet behind the bustling docks and crowded markets, the order built chambers of secrecy, vaults cut deep into rock-held archives, relics, and perhaps the remnants of the treasures carried from Jerusalem. Travellers spoke of underground passages linking towers, of rooms where no outsider was ever admitted, of altars lit only by torchlight, where symbols were carved into the walls. The Grand Masters who ruled from Rhodes styled themselves not just as caretakers of an order, but as princes. They minted coins, signed treaties, and held courts. Yet their authority rested not in royal blood, but in vows, a fact that gave their sovereignty an almost mystical edge. Rhodes became a city-state like no other, a place where monks in armour governed, where hospitals stood beside arsenals, and where chapels were as fortified as castles. The arrival at Rhodes marked the beginning of a golden age for the Hospitallers. They were no longer wanderers displaced from Jerusalem, no longer guests on the lands of kings. They were rulers in their own right, sovereign lords of an island fortress that radiated power across the sea. But with this new authority came new mysteries. The symbols carved into their walls, the secrecy of their vaults, the alignment of their fortifications with patterns older than the Crusades, hinted that the Hospitallers were guarding more than stone. Rhodes was not simply a fortress, it was a statement, a coded message in rock and geometry, declaring that the white cross on black cloth carried secrets that could not be spoken aloud. The year was 1429, when the first great storm broke against the walls of Rhodes. The Ottoman Empire, rising in power and hungry for control of the Mediterranean, hurled its armies against the Hospitallers. Cannons thundered, towers shook, and the sea itself seemed to tremble as ships crowded the horizon. To the ordinary eye, it was a battle of stone and steel, but to those who lived within the fortress, it felt like something more. It was a clash between faith and empire, secrecy and conquest, a trial that would decide whether the white cross would endure or vanish into the sea. The Hospitallers had prepared for this moment. Their walls were thick, their bastions angled with cunning design, and their fleet stood ready to strike. Yet what gave them their greatest strength was not visible to their enemies. Beneath Rhodes stretched a labyrinth of tunnels and chambers, escape routes carved into rock, hidden vaults where manuscripts and relics were sealed away from prying eyes. Some said that maps taken from Jerusalem centuries before were kept there, documents marked with symbols that only a handful of brothers could read. Others whispered of codices written in strange languages, guarded not for treasure but for knowledge. The Ottomans could batter the walls, but they could not touch what was hidden beneath them. The siege dragged on for weeks. By day, arrows rained and cannons roared. By night, the brothers prayed in chapels lit with flickering torches. Chroniclers tell of Hospitallers standing defiantly on the battlements, their robes scorched by fire, their swords gleaming in the smoke. They fought not only for land but for survival. And in the silence of the tunnels below, scribes worked by candlelight, copying manuscripts, sealing documents in iron chests, preparing in case the city fell. It was a battle waged both in the open and in the shadows. When the Ottoman armies finally withdrew, beaten back by the stubborn defense of the Hospitallers, Rhodes stood scarred but unbroken. Songs were sung of the miracle, of how a small brotherhood had repelled the might of an empire. Yet the legends that spread afterward did not only celebrate swords and cannons, they spoke of strange events. Witnesses claimed to have seen torches flickering in tunnels that no soldier had entered. Some swore that secret doors had opened in the walls, allowing Hospitallers to strike suddenly where the enemy least expected. Others believed that coded messages passed through the fortress, guiding defenders with uncanny precision. The greatest siege came later, in the year 1522, when Sultan Suleiman brought an army vast enough to blot out the horizon. For months, Rhodes endured, its defenders dwindling but refusing to surrender. In the end, the Hospitallers were forced to abandon the island, but not before sealing their vaults and spiriting away their most precious treasures. Chroniclers wrote that the Ottomans, when they entered the city, found tunnels empty and vaults barren, as if the secrets had vanished like smoke. The sieges of Rhodes became legend, not just for the battles fought, but for the mysteries preserved. The Hospitallers proved themselves masters of defense, but also masters of secrecy. They could lose walls and towers, but what they carried in silence endured. The Ottomans won the island, but the Hospitallers carried their cross, their fleet, and their hidden manuscripts into exile, ensuring that the story of Rhodes was not an ending but a passage into deeper shadows. When the Templars were crushed in the year 1307 under the order of King Philip IV of France, it seemed their story had ended in fire and chains. Grand Master Jacques de Molay burned at the stake, brothers fled or vanished, and their vast estates were seized. Officially, the order was erased, its memory blackened with charges of heresy. Yet whispers began almost immediately. Not all Templars were captured, and not all their secrets were lost. Some were said to have vanished into the very shadows that the Hospitallers were learning to navigate. The papal decree that dissolved the Templars transferred much of their property to the Hospitallers. On parchment, it was an act of practicality, merging one brotherhood into another. But reality was less clean. Many Hospitallers resisted taking in former rivals, and many surviving Templars resisted being absorbed. Yet strange stories persisted. In villages of southern France, people claimed to see men in white cloaks marked not with the Templar red cross, but with the Hospitallers' white. Some swore the Templars had simply changed their garb, hiding in plain sight within the Hospitallers. The idea of collaboration haunted the corridors of Europe. Both orders had been secretive, both obsessed with relics, codes, and symbols, both with roots in Jerusalem. Was it truly possible that knowledge held by the Templars passed quietly into Hospitaller hands? Chroniclers hinted at meetings in hidden chapels, where displaced knights bent the knee not to Rome, but to a brotherhood of shared silence. There were tales of Templar ships docking at Hospitaller ports, cargoes unloaded under cover of night, sealed chests carried into commanderies where no outsider was permitted. In Rhodes, where the Hospitallers established their fortress after losing Jerusalem, rumours grew thicker. Pilgrims and merchants spoke of tunnels beneath the citadel, lined with crates and casks, stamped with symbols long thought erased. Some claimed to see the Templar double cross carved faintly into stone beside the Hospitaller's 8-pointed star. Others spoke of scrolls exchanged in candlelight, maps of the Holy Land marked with strange geometry that neither church nor crown could decipher. Of course, much of this may have been legend. The fall of the Templars left a wound in the medieval imagination, and people sought explanations, survivors, continuations. To think that they vanished utterly was almost unthinkable, and so the Hospitallers, who had risen as their rivals, became natural vessels for the missing pieces of the story. What unsettled observers most was the persistence of shared symbols. Bees, stars, cryptic knots, and ancient seals began to appear in manuscripts linked to the Hospitallers in the 14th and 15th centuries. Were these mere coincidences, or traces of a hidden fusion between orders? The Vatican itself seemed uneasy. Some records hint at investigations into Hospitaller vaults, papal agents dispatched to Rhodes, even inquiries into their libraries. Yet nothing was ever revealed publicly. Whether or not Templar refugees truly joined their former rivals, the rumour itself changed how people saw the Hospitallers. They were no longer only healers turned warriors. They were guardians of shadows, suspected keepers of knowledge too dangerous to burn. In the end, the fate of the Templars may have been sealed in flames, but their echoes survived in whispers, carried perhaps by the very hands that once swore to oppose them. In the dim glow of a monastery scriptorium, the sound of quills scratching against parchment filled the air. The Hospitallers were not only men of war, but men of words, and their manuscripts became as vital as their swords. These codices were more than simple books. They were lifelines of knowledge, guarded with the same devotion as relics. Within their pages lay remedies for wounds, instructions for surgeries, and recipes for potions that could steady a fever or ease a soldier's last breath. To heal was their original calling, and in these manuscripts the order preserved centuries of wisdom. But there was more. Among the inked lines of anatomy and herb lore appeared star charts drawn with astonishing precision. The Hospitallers studied the skies not only to navigate their growing fleets, but to measure time, track seasons, and perhaps even search for signs. Ships that sailed under their banners used maps that outshone those of rival kingdoms, maps whispered to include details no ordinary cartographer could have guessed. Some suggested these star charts held more than navigational secrets, that they contained codes pointing to hidden routes or forgotten shrines in the east. Ciphers began to weave themselves into the manuscripts. At first, they seemed like scribal marks or odd abbreviations, but to those trained in the Brotherhood's methods, they unlocked layers of meaning. Letters shifted into numbers, symbols replaced words, entire passages concealed truths behind patterns of geometry. A simple line about a herb might conceal directions to a vault, a prayer might mask a family name, and some believed a lineage was hidden there, a genealogy stretching back not just to noble families but to something older, something sacred. The Church never openly accused the Hospitallers of heresy, yet it kept a watchful eye on their libraries. Visitors were rarely allowed to handle the manuscripts, and even among the brothers, access was restricted. There were stories of locked chests stored deep in commanderies, iron-bound and sealed with wax. To break one open, without permission, was said to invite expulsion, or worse. Still, rumours spread. Travellers whispered of codices that told not only of medicine and astronomy, but of bloodlines, names written in delicate script that linked rulers to saints, and perhaps even to the divine itself. The fall of Jerusalem, and later Rhodes, only deepened the sense of mystery. Each time the Hospitallers moved, their manuscripts moved with them. Boxes of books travelled across seas, carried under guard as if they were as precious as gold. When pressed, the brothers would say they carried texts of healing, nothing more. Yet, why then encrypt them so heavily? Why cloak them in symbols that only a handful could read? Perhaps the answer lies in the nature of knowledge itself. To the Hospitallers, wisdom was both a weapon and a shield. A blade can kill a man, but a word written in the right place can preserve a secret for centuries. Their codices and ciphers were more than memory. They were vaults of ink and parchment, binding together the body, the stars, and the soul of a brotherhood that lived not only on battlefields but in shadows of the mind. Step onto the rocky shores of Rhodes, and the first thing you see are walls. Not just walls of stone, but walls carved with meaning. The Hospitallers turned the island into a fortress, yet within its towers and chapels, the whispers of another purpose linger. These buildings were not merely for defense, they were repositories of secrets, cloaked in symbols that outlasted armies. The Hospitallers, like the Templars before them, understood that stone could speak, and so they filled Rhodes with messages that only the attentive could read. Look closer at the churches, and you begin to see patterns. Bees carved into capitals, roses etched into floor tiles, spirals worked into mosaics. To most they were decoration, charming details for a weary pilgrim to admire. But to those who knew the language of symbols, they were signals. The bee, for instance, had long represented immortality and resurrection. It had been the emblem of the Merovingians, whispered descendants of sacred blood. That the Hospitallers used it centuries later was no accident. It was a reminder of continuity, a quiet claim carved where no censor could erase it. The rose too appears again and again, not as a simple flower, but as a layered emblem. 5 petals, sometimes 6 or 7, folded into circles of stone and stained glass. To the church, it could be the Virgin Mary, purity made visible, but in older traditions, the rose stood for secrecy. Sub rosa, under the rose, meant that what was spoken here would never leave the room. Hospitaller halls decorated with roses were not just beautiful. They were coded promises, a signal that secrets were being held, and held tightly. Even the geometry of their castles defies easy explanation. Certain walls align with the solstices, light pouring through narrow slits at exact times of year. Spiral staircases curl not only for defense, but in ratios that echo sacred geometry. Some chapels seem oddly proportioned until you measure them and realize they follow patterns of triangles and hexagons, designs favored by ancient builders who believed numbers themselves carried power. These were not mistakes. They were blueprints of meaning. Travelers who entered the great hall of the palace of the Grand Master might have thought they stood in a fortress of authority, but beneath their feet lay tiles arranged in complex knots with no beginning and no end. To the untrained eye, it was ornament. To initiates it whispered of eternity, of mysteries woven together beyond the reach of steel or fire. Legends grew around these carvings. Locals told of hidden rooms, sealed vaults beneath chapels, where the real treasures of the Hospitallers were stored. Not gold, but manuscripts, maps, and relics, too dangerous to display. The carvings above were said to be clues pointing to these vaults, breadcrumbs for those who could decode the patterns. Perhaps that is why invaders never found them. The secrets of the Hospitallers were not guarded by locks or chains. They were guarded by the patient silence of stone. The island of Rhodes became more than a stronghold. It became a code in itself, a place where walls and chapels held meanings that outlasted battles. Bees, roses, and geometry were not mere art. They were memory carved into rock, memory the Hospitallers knew would survive even if their order did not. In that way, the island itself became their greatest secret. The sea was restless when the Hospitallers left Rhodes. Their order bruised but not broken, they sailed west, searching for a new home. The year was 1530, and the knights arrived at a rocky archipelago in the heart of the Mediterranean, Malta. To most, it was barren stone, windswept and poor in resources. To the Hospitallers, it was a gift, a fortress waiting to be shaped. Here they would not simply survive. They would build a bastion, strong enough to defy empires, and deep enough to guard the secrets they carried across the sea. From the moment they arrived, the knights began carving Malta into a fortress. Valletta, their capital, rose from cliffs and limestone quarries, like a city designed by both masons and mystics. The walls were so thick that cannon fire seemed to sink into them without effect. Bastions jutted like blades into the sea, forcing enemy fleets to scatter. But the real genius of the Maltese fortifications lay beneath. Tunnels, chambers, and hidden vaults wound under the streets, a labyrinth known only to the Order. Some were storehouses for food and weapons. Others, it is said, were built for something far less ordinary. Whispers spread that the Hospitallers carried more than supplies from Rhodes. Chests sealed in wax and iron, scrolls wrapped in cloth, relics shrouded in secrecy. If the knights had guarded knowledge in Jerusalem and Rhodes, then Malta became the vault that would never fall. Local masons told stories of strange instructions from the Order's engineers. Certain staircases were to follow precise ratios. Certain windows had to align with solstices. At first the designs seemed eccentric, but when completed, the city felt like a puzzle in stone, as if the entire fortress was itself a cipher. When the Ottoman Empire came in 1565, with one of the largest invading forces of the century, Malta was tested. The siege lasted months. Cannon fire rained day and night. The sea was thick with ships and smoke. Yet the Hospitallers endured. Every breach was patched. Every tower held. Some say the knights were fueled not only by faith, but by a deeper purpose, to protect whatever was hidden beneath their feet. Defeat would not only mean death, it would mean the loss of their most guarded inheritance. Even after victory, the Hospitallers treated Malta as more than a base. They filled it with chapels and palaces decorated in their familiar language of symbols. Bees reappeared in carvings, roses adorned arches. Geometric patterns covered courtyards. To a traveller, it was decoration. To the initiated, it was assurance that their legacy continued. Beneath Valletta lay rooms sealed for centuries, some still locked to this day. What they hold remains speculation. Maps, relics, genealogies perhaps, waiting in silence. Malta became more than stone and cannon. It became a sanctuary of memory, where every wall defended both the body of the Order and the secrets of its soul. For 2 centuries, the knights made the island unbreakable, a vault in the sea that kept both enemies and truths at bay. And even now, when you walk its narrow streets and touch the cool limestone, you cannot help but wonder, was Malta built as a fortress of men, or as a fortress of mysteries? The summer of 1565 was unlike any other in Malta. The sea itself seemed to tremble under the weight of the Ottoman fleet, as hundreds of ships crowded the horizon. The Hospitallers, numbering only a few thousand men, stood against an army that dwarfed them many times over. The island was outnumbered, outgunned, and surrounded. Yet the knights prepared not just for survival, but for something far more symbolic. This was to be the moment when faith, stone, and secrecy collided. The siege began with thunder. Cannons roared day and night, their iron balls slamming into the bastions of Street Elmo, Street Michael, and Street Angelo. Smoke choked the skies, and the very walls seemed to melt under fire. But the Hospitallers refused to surrender. They fought with a desperation that seemed beyond human endurance, as if defending Malta meant defending more than land. Legends grew quickly. Some said saints were seen walking the walls. Others swore angels carried arrows back into the enemy lines. To the soldiers, these stories were hope, but to those who knew the deeper mission of the Order, they hinted at something else. A belief that hidden within Malta lay truths too sacred to fall into Ottoman hands. During the chaos of bombardment, whispers moved through the ranks. Caravans of chests were said to have been carried through tunnels under Valletta, disappearing into chambers so deep that even if the city was lost, the archives would remain. Locals who aided the knights told tales of sealed vaults hastily bricked shut, passages collapsing behind them as if by design. Some believed the Hospitallers had planned for this moment long before, building Malta not just as a fortress of war, but as a fortress of memory. The siege dragged on for months. Street Elmo fell after heroic resistance, yet its fall cost the Ottomans dearly. Every step forward seemed to bleed their strength. Heat and disease ravaged the invaders, while the Hospitallers held fast behind battered walls, each day another miracle of endurance. When reinforcements finally arrived from Sicily in September, the tide turned. The Ottoman army, exhausted and broken, retreated. Malta stood scarred but undefeated, and the Hospitallers were hailed across Europe as saviours of Christendom. But behind the victory celebrations, questions lingered. What exactly had the knights been so determined to protect? Contemporary accounts mention the movement of relics and documents, but no record survived of what those archives contained. Later, chroniclers speculated they included genealogies of royal families, ancient texts preserved from Jerusalem, and relics tied to the Holy Sepulchre. The Ottomans may have sought conquest, but the Hospitallers believed they sought something more, something that could not be allowed to fall into foreign hands. The Great Siege became legend, not only for the courage of a few thousand men against overwhelming odds, but for the mystery of what lay beneath the stones they defended. Victory ensured that Malta would remain in Hospitaller hands for centuries, yet the secrets sealed within its tunnels remained untouched, waiting in silence. To this day, the island carries that echo. Every bastion, every chapel, every vaulted corridor whispers that the true prize of Malta was never its soil or its stone, but the unseen knowledge hidden below. Walk into a Hospitaller chapel, and the air feels heavy, not just with incense but with memory. Behind gilded reliquaries and marble altars, there were always rumours of something more, things not displayed to the public, things too dangerous or too sacred to be seen. The Knights Hospitaller were known as guardians of relics, and while pilgrims believed these treasures were fragments of saints or splinters of the true cross, whispers suggested their vaults held objects that blurred the line between faith and power. From their earliest days in Jerusalem, the knights were entrusted with relics recovered from battlefields, churches, and hidden shrines. Pilgrims brought offerings, nobles sent gifts, and crusaders returned with spoils said to be touched by holy hands. Some were undoubtedly genuine, others crafted to inspire devotion, but a few stood out. Chroniclers hinted at vessels carved of stone unlike any in the region, manuscripts older than the Crusades themselves, and relics whose descriptions were deliberately vague, as if clarity would invite danger. One story speaks of a chalice, not golden, not jewelled, but plain and unassuming. It was kept not in a church, but in a sealed chamber, guarded day and night. The brothers called it the vessel, never naming it outright. Whether it was the Holy Grail, or merely believed to be so, its presence gave the order a strange aura. Those who drank from it were said to be strengthened beyond fatigue, though none outside the order ever confirmed such tales. There were also documents, rolls of parchment wrapped in oilcloth and sealed with wax. Some claimed they were genealogies, charts tracing bloodlines back to figures whose names had been erased from official histories. These lineages, if true, would have challenged the authority of both kings and popes, for they hinted at descent, not from noble houses, but from something far older, something that could overturn centuries of doctrine. To guard such secrets was not just a duty of faith, it was a duty of survival. The Hospitallers built hidden chambers in their fortresses, vaults within vaults where these relics could be stored. When Rhodes fell, the archives moved. When Malta was besieged, the chests were carried into tunnels, always protected, always silent. Local legends grew that beneath Valletta, entire libraries of forbidden knowledge were hidden, waiting for a time when it could be revealed. But that time never came, or perhaps it was never meant to. The knights spoke rarely of what they guarded, but symbols etched into their chapels told their own stories. Bees, roses, stars with 7 points, all woven into frescoes and carvings. To the faithful they were decoration. To the initiated they were reminders. They whispered of continuity, of bloodlines that endured quietly in the shadows of power. By the time Europe entered the modern age, most believed these stories to be nothing more than myths. Yet, the Hospitallers themselves never denied them outright. Silence was their answer, and silence often speaks louder than words. For if the knights were truly guardians of relics and bloodlines, then their greatest secret was not the relics themselves, but the reason they were hidden. What power could a vessel or a parchment hold to terrify kings and churchmen alike? Perhaps the answer lies not in the objects, but in the possibility that faith and blood were bound together, a truth too disruptive to ever be spoken aloud. Not all battles are fought with swords. Some are fought with words whispered in courts, with gold slipped across tables, with letters written in coded ink. The Hospitallers mastered this quieter kind of warfare. While the world saw them as warriors in black robes bearing the white cross, behind the scenes they acted as spies, diplomats, and even bankers. Their influence stretched through Europe, not with banners and trumpets, but with shadows. By the 15th century, the Order's commanderies were spread across the continent like a web. Each one collected rents, taxes, and donations, funneling wealth back to the central convent. But money was more than sustenance, it was leverage. Kings owed debts to the Hospitallers, merchants relied on their safe routes, and nobles entrusted them with estates. If the Order ever wanted to, they could choke the finances of entire regions simply by shutting their coffers. Yet they rarely boasted of this power. Silence and subtlety were their shields. Spies moved under their banner as easily as pilgrims. A knight could ride from Malta to Paris or from Rhodes to Venice, and no one questioned his presence. Under the guise of charity and diplomacy, the Hospitallers carried letters sealed in wax that sometimes bore more than polite greetings. Reports of enemy fleets, notes of secret treaties, rumours of rebellions, all flowed through their couriers. Some say they even exchanged information with their old rivals, the remnants of the Templars, if only to ensure knowledge too dangerous for monarchs remained in the hands of those who knew its weight. Diplomacy was their second battlefield. When empires clashed, the Hospitallers often acted as intermediaries. Their envoys stood in royal courts, advising kings and mediating disputes. They were trusted because they appeared neutral, a brotherhood bound to no crown. Yet neutrality was an illusion. Every promise made, every handshake sealed, tilted the balance of power. They knew how to appear loyal, while quietly steering the course of nations. Banking added another layer to their shadow diplomacy. Like the Templars before them, the Hospitallers created systems of credit and safe deposits for travellers. A pilgrim could leave funds in London and withdraw them in Acre, all under the Order's protection. This financial network gave them insight into trade routes, markets, and political alliances. They knew which monarchs were solvent and which were drowning in debt, information as valuable as any army. To hold that knowledge was to hold invisible power. European rulers recognized their reach, yet few dared to challenge it. The Hospitallers rarely flaunted their influence. They did not raise new crowns or demand territories beyond their islands. Instead, they worked quietly, shaping events from behind curtains. To some, this restraint was noble. To others, it was unnerving. Power that hides is power that cannot be measured, and that is the kind of power feared most. The Hospitallers were warriors, yes, but they were also shadows. In every court where politics boiled, in every marketplace where gold changed hands, in every rumour that spread across borders, their presence lingered. They fought with steel when needed, but more often they won their battles with silence. And silence, as always, leaves the deepest echoes. By the 17th century, the Hospitallers no longer ruled vast crusade estates. but their influence still reached into places where most kingdoms could not tread. The black cross on their robes carried a legacy that stretched back to Jerusalem, and with it came suspicion, rivalry, and fear. The Jesuits, rising in power as the intellectual arm of the Catholic Church, often found themselves at odds with the older brotherhood. The Jesuits were teachers and confessors to kings, men of words and persuasion. The Hospitallers were soldiers turned guardians of secrets. Both orders sought influence over Europe, yet their methods clashed. To some observers, the tension between them was not simply about politics but about knowledge itself. The papacy, too, played a double game. Officially, the Hospitallers served the Pope, their survival dependent on papal favour. Yet behind closed doors, popes often questioned just how much the order still concealed. Whispers of relics hidden in Maltese vaults, of genealogical records carried from the Holy Land, made some churchmen uneasy. Too much knowledge could unravel carefully built doctrine. And so the papal court alternated between praise and suspicion, rewarding the knights with privileges while keeping them under watchful eyes. Then there were the Freemasons. By the 18th century, lodges across Europe filled with nobles, scholars, and revolutionaries. Their rituals carried echoes of the Templars, long destroyed but never forgotten. Yet some Masonic symbols also resembled those of the Hospitallers: bees, roses, stars, and sacred geometry appearing where they should not. Did the Masons borrow from the Knights? Or were fragments of Hospitaller knowledge deliberately passed into these secret societies as a way of survival? The line between theft and inheritance blurred, and soon rumours swirled that certain Masonic lodges had ties to Hospitaller archives. The Jesuits accused the Masons of heresy. The papacy condemned their gatherings. The Hospitallers stood silent, their role uncertain. Were they adversaries of these groups, or quiet collaborators, custodians ensuring that forbidden knowledge would never die, even if it had to wear new clothes? No chronicler gives a clear answer, but too many coincidences linger. The same symbols carved into Maltese chapels appeared in Masonic regalia. Jesuit treatises denounced ideas that suspiciously mirrored legends tied to Hospitaller vaults. It was as if three great currents of knowledge were colliding beneath the surface of European history. The Hospitallers themselves kept to their image as defenders of faith and caregivers to the sick. But among their ranks, stories persisted of manuscripts too dangerous to reveal, maps of hidden shrines, and bloodlines traced across centuries. If such knowledge truly existed, the Jesuits would have sought to absorb it, the papacy to suppress it, and the Masons to protect it in coded rituals. The Hospitallers, caught in between, became invisible custodians, protecting without admitting, guarding without boasting. Rivalries persisted because secrecy breeds suspicion. The more the Hospitallers held their silence, the more others tried to guess what that silence concealed. Perhaps that was their greatest weapon. Not their swords, not their ships, but the unshakable ability to hide in plain sight, shaping history without ever stepping fully into it. Their rivals fought in pulpits, in courts, and in lodges, but the Hospitallers kept their eyes on the deeper mission: to guard knowledge that could not be spoken, only carried, from century to century, waiting. The year was 1798, when the sound of French cannons echoed across the limestone walls of Malta. Napoleon Bonaparte had arrived with his fleet on the way to Egypt, and the Hospitallers, once feared across the Mediterranean, found themselves unable to resist. The order that had survived crusades, sieges, and centuries of enemies was broken not by faithless armies of the East, but by the ambition of a European conqueror. The White Cross that had stood for defiance now fell without a true battle. The knights surrendered, and with that surrender, Malta was lost. Yet, even in defeat, questions rose. How could a fortress that had withstood the great siege of 1565 collapse in a matter of days? Some claimed the knights had grown complacent, their numbers dwindled, and their discipline softened. Others whispered that the fall was staged, a desperate choice to preserve something hidden beneath the island. If the French had stormed Malta by force, they would have ransacked every chapel, every crypt, every vault. By surrendering, the Hospitallers may have bought time to move what mattered most. Local tales speak of chests carried under cover of night, smuggled onto ships bound for Italy and beyond. Manuscripts wrapped in oilskin, maps written in code, and relics that had crossed centuries of secrecy were said to vanish from Malta just before Napoleon's arrival. Where they went, no one agrees. Some say Rome, others suggest hidden monasteries in Switzerland. A few point to private estates in southern France, where old families with quiet ties to the order became custodians of their legacy. After the loss of Malta, the order seemed finished, their power broken, their lands confiscated, their identity shattered. But the Hospitallers had reinvented themselves before, and they would again. By the 19th century, they began to re-emerge, not as warriors of the sword, but as warriors of service. Hospitals, charities, and relief missions became their new battlefield. Outwardly, they seemed transformed, yet their rituals remained cloaked in secrecy. Initiations still spoke of vows in darkness, symbols of bees and roses still appeared, and whispered prayers still hinted at truths that never reached the public. Even Napoleon himself may have played a role in this strange rebirth. At his coronation in 1804, golden bees decorated his robes, the same emblem once tied to the Merovingian kings and preserved in Hospitaller chapels. Was it coincidence, or did Napoleon know of the old bloodline legends and seek to tie himself to them? The Hospitallers never spoke, but the echo was unmistakable. Though stripped of Malta, the order endured in fragments, its members scattered across Europe, some continuing their mission in hospitals, others keeping alive the rituals and archives in private halls. The world saw decline, but within their silence, the Hospitallers carried rebirth, for their true strength was never in walls of stone, but in the secrets too deeply rooted to be conquered. The White Cross faded from the battlefield, but the memory of their hidden knowledge continued, waiting for a time when the world might ask again what the Hospitallers had always guarded. Step into a Masonic lodge, and you are surrounded by symbols, twin pillars rising at the front, the all-seeing eye, the compass and square, a beehive in the corner, often overlooked but never without meaning. These images have their roots in many traditions, but some historians and storytellers argue that they carry the imprint of the Hospitallers. After the fall of Malta and the scattering of the order, there are whispers that elements of their rituals, their codes, and even their hidden knowledge found a second life inside Freemasonry. The connection is not obvious at first glance. Freemasonry emerged in the 17th and 18th centuries, long after the Hospitallers had lost their crusading power. Yet, in its hierarchy of degrees, in its oaths of secrecy, and in its use of symbols carved into stone and ritual, echoes of the old knightly order can be heard. The Hospitallers lived by vows of service, obedience, and silence. The Masons echoed the same vows, binding their members by ritual words and handshakes known only to initiates. To outsiders, these parallels might be coincidence, but to those who search for continuity, they feel like fingerprints left behind. Symbols deepen the mystery. The beehive, long used by the Hospitallers to represent immortality and divine order, reappeared in Masonic teaching as a model of industry and unity. The rose, carved into Hospitaller chapels as a mark of secrecy, became the rose of the Rosicrucians, a mystical offshoot often linked with Masonry. Even geometric designs like the hexagram, the vesica piscis, and the endless knot show up in both places, suggesting a shared language of symbols meant to carry truths across generations. Rituals, too, may reveal a hidden thread. In Masonic ceremonies, initiates undergo symbolic death and rebirth, a dramatized passage into secrecy and enlightenment. Hospitaller traditions spoke of vows taken in darkness, of a knight transformed by service and secrecy into something beyond himself. Both orders used drama not as entertainment but as memory, embedding lessons too dangerous to be written plainly into action and symbol. A ritual remembered is harder to erase than a text that can be burned. Some researchers argue that remnants of the Templars also flowed into Masonry, and that the Hospitallers inherited and guarded fragments of Templar tradition after their suppression in the 14th century. If so, then Masonry may represent not just the survival of one order, but the fusion of many. Hospitaller discipline, Templar mystique, and ancient esoteric lore blended into a fraternity that could thrive even in a modern world suspicious of knights and crusades. Official historians of Freemasonry deny a direct link, insisting their order arose from guilds of stonemasons and builders. But even they cannot ignore the fascination with knightly imagery, with references to crusader orders, and with degrees named after the very brotherhoods supposedly destroyed centuries earlier. Why would a guild of builders adopt the rituals of warriors unless some knowledge had been passed quietly, secretly, hand to hand? The truth may never be known. Yet when you look at a Masonic lodge filled with symbols that once lined Hospitaller chapels, you begin to wonder. Perhaps the knights did not vanish. Perhaps their legacy was never meant to survive in fortresses of stone, but in lodges of silence, where bees, roses, and geometry continue to speak for those who remember. Whispers of bloodlines are older than the Hospitallers themselves, but the order's silence kept those whispers alive. From Jerusalem to Rhodes to Malta, rumours followed them that they guarded not only relics and maps, but records of families whose ancestry stretched back to the beginnings of Christianity. These genealogies were not kept in public libraries or announced from pulpits. They were sealed in chests, written in ciphers, hidden in chapels where only the initiated could read the signs. If the Hospitallers preserved such records, it would explain their uncanny influence in European courts, where kings and popes alike treated them with respect that far outweighed their dwindling armies. The legends suggest that among their archives were scrolls that traced noble houses not just to ancient tribes or Roman patricians, but to names far more controversial. Some spoke of a lineage beginning with Mary Magdalene and a child, carried across the sea into southern France, and merged with the families of the Merovingian kings. If such a bloodline survived, then every monarch who claimed authority by divine right would stand challenged by the idea that divinity had once walked in flesh and passed on through descendants. The Hospitallers never confirmed it, but they never denied it either. Silence is sometimes the loudest answer. Throughout the late Middle Ages, certain noble families in France, Germany, and Spain were consistently tied to the Hospitallers. Donations flowed from them, marriages linked them, and their estates often neighboured Hospitaller commanderies. Some of these families carried names that echoed with strange persistence: Dagobert, Sigisbert, and Sarah, names that reached back to Merovingian lore. Were these coincidences, or careful continuities preserved in genealogies that the Hospitallers secretly protected? There are stories of relics tied to these families, rings inscribed with bees, seals marked with roses, and documents that appeared briefly in archives only to vanish again. In one tale from the 17th century, a monk described seeing a chart hidden in a Maltese chapel that traced a line of descent through centuries of European nobility. He claimed the names connected not only to kings, but to popes, suggesting the sacred bloodline had infiltrated both throne and altar. Days after his account was written, the chart disappeared, and the monk himself faded from records. Even Napoleon is said to have brushed against this hidden legacy. When he ordered golden bees embroidered onto his coronation robes in 1804, some believed he was deliberately tying himself to the ancient bloodline once guarded by the Hospitallers. Others insisted he simply admired the symbol's elegance, yet the connection to Merovingian kings and their supposed sacred descent was too uncanny to ignore. If the Hospitallers truly preserved genealogical secrets, their role was not simply military or charitable, but custodial in the deepest sense. They were guardians not only of relics, but of memory, of a story too dangerous to tell openly. Perhaps they believed the world was not ready to know that faith and blood could intertwine, that divine legacy might walk among men disguised as ordinary nobility. Or perhaps the secret was never meant to be revealed at all, only preserved like a flame in the darkness, carried from century to century in silence. When people think of the Hospitallers today, they imagine hospitals, charities, and the Red Cross on a white field. Their modern descendants, the Order of Malta, run ambulances, refugee shelters, and relief missions across the world. On the surface, they seem to be nothing more than a noble institution of service, stripped of the swords and fortresses that once defined them. But if you step closer, past the uniforms and the ceremonies, past the neat explanations written in history books, another picture begins to take shape. The Hospitallers were never just warriors or healers. They were guardians of memory. From Jerusalem to Rhodes, from Malta to modern Europe, they carried more than relics. They carried stories. Some written on parchment, some etched into stone, some hidden in symbols that still appear where no one expects them. Bees carved into old chapels, roses painted in frescoes, geometries that align with the stars. To the untrained eye, these are decorations. To those who know the language of secrecy, they are reminders that the Order's real mission was never abandoned. It simply changed form. Historians still debate whether the Hospitallers preserved genealogies, maps of lost shrines, or relics tied to sacred bloodlines. The records that might prove such things remain elusive, locked in private archives or scattered across monasteries. But what cannot be denied is their ability to endure. Every time their fortress fell, their knowledge survived. When Jerusalem was lost, they carried their archives to Cyprus. When Rhodes fell, the chests moved again. When Malta surrendered, manuscripts were smuggled away under the cover of night. The lesson is clear. The Hospitallers understood that walls crumble, but memory, if carefully guarded, can last forever. In the modern age, their presence is quieter but no less curious. The Order of Malta still holds diplomatic status with nations across the globe, a sovereign entity without territory, yet with influence in halls of power. They maintain archives few are allowed to see, and their rituals still draw from traditions older than most nations. Some see only harmless ceremony. Others suspect fragments of hidden continuity, pieces of the same knowledge that once made them feared rivals of kings and popes. To call them guardians of memory is to acknowledge that their true strength was never only in the sword, it was in preservation. Knowledge that could not be spoken, secrets that could not be written plainly, symbols that could outlast fire and conquest. They turned their order into a vessel for memory itself, carrying it forward across centuries, waiting for moments when the world was ready to glimpse it again. Today, when you see their emblem, you might think only of ambulances and hospitals. But perhaps behind that emblem lies a longer story, one of relics hidden and genealogies guarded, of cultures preserved when empires collapsed, of truths too dangerous to name. The Hospitallers may no longer ride into battle, but in their quiet endurance they continue to shape history from behind the veil. They remain what they have always been, keepers of secrets and guardians of memory,